Welcome to Outrage Overload, a science podcast about outrage and lowering the temperature. This is episode 33. Americans across the political spectrum say they're concerned about the health of our democracy.
According to voters in our latest NBC News poll, threats to democracy, the issue surpasses the cost of living, the economy, and immigration. But where voters stand on what those threats are depends on which side of the aisle they sit. When Democrats, who said it was the most important issue, were asked what threats to democracy means, they gave a variety of responses, including voter suppression, election fraud, and Trumpism. When Republicans were asked the same question, their answers included government control, censorship, and political corruption.
But how can this be? In a nation built on freedom and self-government, why does the future of democracy seem so uncertain? Well, that's what we're going to talk about on this episode of the Outrage Overload Podcast. I'm your host, David Beckmeyer, and in this episode, we're going to delve into the paradox of democratic erosion. We explore the surprising reasons why even those who value democracy might contribute to its decline, with a researcher at the forefront of this work.
So my name is Alia Braley. I am a PhD candidate at UC Berkeley in the Department of Political Science. I'm also a visiting scholar at the Agora Institute at Johns Hopkins University and will very soon be joining the Digital Economy Lab at Stanford University. My research focuses on nonviolent action in civil conflict, as well as democratic backsliding and political polarization, with a specific focus on political psychology.
We're looking at research that's both alarming and thought-provoking, revealing a disturbing willingness among U.S. partisans to subvert democratic norms. But what's more intriguing is the underlying cause, the perception that their political opponents are ready to do the same. Here's Stanford sociology professor Rob Willer.
Democrats estimate Republicans' support for political violence at levels that are 400% higher than they really are, and it's pretty much the same for Republicans perceiving Democrats' support for violence. When you give people corrective information that fixes those misperceptions, you find that people then will ratchet down their own support for political violence. It's almost as though people are supporting political violence at the levels they do because they don't want to bring a knife to a gunfight. They assume they're in a gunfight. When they find out they're not, they sort of stand down a little bit.
To unravel this complex web of political psychology, the authors conducted experimental studies involving over 4,000 participants manipulating perceptions about their opponent's commitment to democratic norms. The results were nothing short of transformative. When partisans were made aware that their rivals were more committed to democratic principles than previously believed, their own dedication to upholding these norms increased significantly. This finding opens up a fascinating avenue for understanding how political narratives, accusations, and misinformation can potentially fuel democratic backsliding. So buckle up for an intellectually stimulating conversation that could redefine how we perceive the delicate balance of democracy in our world with Alia Braley. I was going to say Professor Braley, but that's not right. So I wanted to thank you for coming on the show, Alia Braley.
Call me Alia. Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, so one thing I liked about this paper is, unlike a lot of the stuff I talk about, it kind of has some optimism in it because it sort of talks about, some ways maybe we can reverse some of these negative trends. So I like that a lot, and we're definitely going to sort of dive into that a little bit. And I wanted to mention, you mentioned, that your one of your focuses is democratic backsliding, and I kind of wanted to kind of introduce that to the audience. It's a pretty, you could probably kind of just intuit what it means, but and I know in the book, How Democracies Die, the authors Stephen Levitsky and Daniel Ziblatt sort of talk about how most democracies died not through like a violent overthrow, but sort of a gradual weakening of democratic norms and institutions, and that's kind of the same idea or roughly related to the democratic backsliding, right?
Yes. Yeah. That's exactly the same thing, I would say. It's just a nifty little term.
Yeah, and so and I think like I'm particularly interested in sort of this whole idea of norms recently, or as been doing this podcast more and more. It's been kind of on my mind. I think we sort of think we have a country of laws, but I think we really sort of have a country of norms, and and a bad actor can sort of take advantage of that. And I always talk about the idea that Constitution doesn't defend itself. And Peter Ditto was on the show, and he told us about how if we start feeling aggrieved by the sort of moral infractions committed by the other side, it sort of moves the bar for what we consider moral. And this seems to be kind of a similar kind of thing where we start granting our side more authority or violating democratic norms, if you will, in hopes of protecting us from the other side. And I think political campaigns and elites in both parties kind of weaponize this. They just kind of hammer with this stuff, stoking fear. And your research seems to be showing, if I'm reading it right, that this makes us more vulnerable to this democratic backsliding. And I guess this is kind of what you refer to as the subversion dilemma. It's kind of a spin on the prisoner's dilemma. I don't know. I guess that's a lot to say there, so I'll let you talk. Kind of comment on all that.
Yeah, definitely. I love that you said the Constitution doesn't defend itself. Is something I often repeat as well, not just in the U.S., but in every country. I'm really in agreement that the institutions of democracy, not just the Constitution, but they can all be weaponized essentially. And I think that's what we're seeing in a lot of different countries, again, not just the US. And that learning is kind of going across borders in some cases, I think. And that's like kind of a negative learning. It's like how to appear to have the veneer of a democracy, but actually you've stacked the courts and you've rigged the election system. So, and then when it gets to the question of what you were saying about fear, I think that there's different ways we could fear political opponents in a democracy. So I think like some big categories that I think about are like what they're going to do policy wise. And I think there's a lot of that, and that's meaningful. And then there's misperceptions around that have been documented by other scholars, as well as I replicate in this article. And then there's fear, I think, about the other side, so to speak, is willing to do to democracy. And so I think that what's interesting to me is that previously there's been a lot of focus on the policy side. So like, what is the other party going to do policy wise? But I think there's also an actual value of democracy that people have. They want, like, especially in the United States, the polls very high for democracy, but then what changes people's behavior from, supporting candidates that are pro-democracy to candidates that are subverting democracy. And that's the kind of dilemma that I think citizens are facing, because if you have politicians that are maybe trusted for other reasons saying the other side is going to take away democracy, they're trying to steal elections, then it actually becomes rational. It makes sense to quote, quote, save democracy by undermining it. So I think there's this kind of paradoxical thing, and I could say a lot more about it, but I'll let you reflect about that.
Well, yeah, I think that's a big piece of it that I do want to dive into a little bit more. I mean, with your work, were you able to sort of come up with an idea of how we could even kind of agree on what democracy means and what subverting it means? Because even what you just said there, that paradox, right? We simultaneously support democracy and simultaneously vote to tear it down.
Yeah. And that's something also I want to point out is in a lot of different countries around the world. So it's like this US issue, but it's also around the world. There's really high support for democracy. And yes, so it is interesting. There isn't even agreement among political scientists. What does democracy mean? Never mind among the general population. So one thing that we did in our study was definitely not use the word democracy to people who were taking part in our study, because we didn't want people's imaginations to come into play. We don't want that. There's definitely, I would say, some probably really interesting, and I have some new research looking into that a little bit, differences in what parts of democracy maybe Republicans or Democrats value and what parts they're worried about either their own politicians undermining or opposing politicians undermining. But there are some also cool studies. Mostly I've been looking at the Bright Lines Project, which has done polls across the US and found a whole bunch of norms that largely Democrats and Republicans agree on. And so that's why we focused our study on just asking about these specific norms that have a high degree of agreement. So an example being not freezing the social media accounts of opposing of journalists that like write for the leading newspapers of like opposing party, or not banning rallies of the other side, or not removing voting stations from areas that support your political opponents. So I think these are all things that show a high level of support, and that people typically, even in our surveys before the treatment, they show a very high like level of wanting to support those norms.
Yeah. So, let's dive into that part a little bit, because the nice thing as I mentioned before, is that your research sort of shows that maybe there's some way to reverse some of this. And, you actually found that if you could lower this perception gap a little bit and have people not see the other side as ready to, not as be aggressive towards subverting democracy as you think they are, that could change your thoughts on it as well, and your not only that, but change like your actions and how you might vote and the kind of things you would support.
Yeah. So as I kind of mentioned in my introduction, I've typically studied more like hot conflict type situations. So I think that's why this particular angle on polarization in the U.S. and democracy occurred to me. I think that there is this thing where people will act against like their own interests if they, or participating something that's actually a loss for them, like war, for example, if they believe that they're sufficiently threatened by the other side. And the misperceptions that we found for the other party's willingness to undermine democracy were actually quite a bit larger than on the other side's support for different policy issues. And interventions that have like changed and corrected those misperceptions like have worked less well than our intervention has in terms of reducing partisan animosity or increasing people's democratic attitudes. So I think the lesson is like there really is something there where people are experiencing real fear about democracy. I think that's becoming more and more maybe common knowledge, but the idea that it's not just that they're afraid, it's that there's these exaggerated perceptions of what the typical person who's of the opposing party actually wants to support and actually believes it's okay. So I think that's where there is hope, because there is this alignment, and then obviously you need to do something with that. But there is this area where on core democratic issues that Republicans and Democrats largely seem to support, even from the far left to the far right in a lot of cases. I'm not saying extremists of any kind, but like the entire spectrum.
Right. People that are pretty strongly party aligned. Yeah. I mean, I was very surprised by those numbers that, I think a couple things stood out, and you can tell me if I got these wrong. But one is that the sort of baseline amount that you sort of would uphold democracy was about the same on both sides, and the difference between what you perceived as the other side was pretty far. I mean, your level, your self-reported level of how much you support democracy, and then your idea of what the other side does was pretty big difference, and it was about the same. There wasn't a big difference, if I recall right, between Republicans and Democrats.
Yeah, honestly, I was surprised by that, and I have had to like think through it a little bit. But there was, we asked 7 questions about 7 different norms, and basically pretty consistently, we have both Republicans and Democrats. On average, a person will say maybe they would support breaking one of these norms, but on average, they think someone on the other side would say they would break about 5 of the 7. So it's like 4 times as many as the person actually expresses themselves. So it is very symmetrical. And also the treatment effect of telling people what the other side actually had to say is also highly symmetrical. There's not really an observable difference.
I'm going to jump in here real quick. This use of the term symmetrical here is kind of used in a very particular way in political science. In this context, more or less what this means is there was not a big difference between Democrats and Republicans in this study, in the self-reporting of this study. So Democrats and Republicans both reported about the same tendency to violate this, about the same amount of norms, and both Republicans and Democrats misperceived what they thought the other side would be willing to violate by about a factor of 4. Both Republicans and Democrats came out about the same on that, and likewise, both Republicans and Democrats came out about the same on their improvement after treatment. So that's what we're talking about when we're using this term symmetrical here. We'll get back to the interview.
It's about 25% reduction in their own willingness to undermine democracy. So yeah, seems to be a lot of similarities in this way between Democrats and Republicans. And like I'm walking straight into it, but we get into a lot of like hot water at some point when we start to talk about this, but I'll let you say whatever your thoughts might be on the matter first.
No, I want to hear the hot water. Tell me about the hot water.
The hot water is that we've gotten a lot of pushback every step of the way because we show people these symmetrical plots, and then the feedback is Trump is undermining democracy as a Republican, and Trumpists, who are Republicans following him, are supporting him in doing this. This is not a symmetrical story. How dare you, basically? And, how dare you, someone contacted the IRB and said, we were spreading like Republican propaganda because we said that Republicans support democracy. It was like, there's been a lot of pushback against this. But it's actually, I think, a misinterpretation of what we're saying to take that approach. So the larger story that we think is happening, and that these symmetries are just like one instantiation of, one small part of, is that someone who's aspiring for power without regard to democracy, and sometimes they call them aspiring autocrats, and Trump would fit into this category, will basically stoke fears that the other side is going to undermine democracy. He started saying at the very start of his campaign in 2016 that Hillary Clinton was going to steal the election. So it's been from the very start. And I've also worked on analyzing his tweets, and a very large portion, sometimes up to 30%, are blaming Democrats or the media for essentially undermining democracy. By contrast, very few are actually insulting people, which is, he insults people a lot, but like the actual, I think a lot of the work that he's doing is being done in this space where he's convincing his supporters that Democrats will undermine democracy. So even though Republicans would largely want to uphold these norms, I think I've already talked about that a few times, they become more willing. So then you think, well, then why are Democrats not seeming still more committed to democracy than Republicans? I can only theorize, and the whole thing's been theory so far. Theory is useful. But I can only theorize that Democrats, likewise, are perceiving what are in many ways real oversteps by Trump and by other Republican leaders. And like January 6th is just the easiest one to point to, and are also loosening their hold on their willingness to uphold democratic norms. And I think, and my co-authors, we've talked about this as well, that probably Democrat leaders could, if they were so inclined, use that leverage to act more, more constitutional hard, but also to speak more undermining of norms in the name of saving democracy from, say, Trump. But what I see is them using restraint. So there's this space in between what people say they want and what politicians do with that. And so in some countries, you didn't see as much restraint on an opposing side to, for instance, an incumbent aspiring autocrat. And there's been some work in comparative politics done that shows that when you're opposing an aspiring autocrat and you're not using democratic restraint, it actually accelerates the pace of democratic backsliding compared to when you have a party that's opposing an aspiring autocrat and holding steady, holding to democratic norms. And then also what we're trying to look into is how do you then also reduce fears, perhaps among Republicans, about what they think Democrats are up to.
Right. And, in terms of what we could do here to sort of lower this perception gap, one of the challenges, one of the things I worry about is sort of this trust factor. I mean, you were just talking about maybe there's some way to convince, Republicans that, that the other side is not as bad as they think they are, and or particularly on this issue of democratic norms. And, and I worry about that trust thing because right now we really dislike each other so much. We have so much animosity and there's so little trust. And you talk about maybe the idea of the way to overcome that might be maybe through some kind of a third party approach. And you use this term, which I don't completely know what it means, of, quote, costly signals of good faith, end quote. So maybe those are some ways that maybe we could bridge that perception gap, maybe?
Yeah, definitely. I'll get to third-party guarantees, but it just occurred to me that I said everything I just said in like the longest way possible. And I think a really shorter way that might help people would just be to say that our study is about perceptions, not about reality. And I think that one really important thing for me is that one option you can do if you look at perceptions that might not be based in reality, like Republicans' belief that elections are being stolen or they're not very secure in the United States, or not sufficiently secure, is you could say, oh, like they don't really believe that. I think that's a really common response. So it's kind of dismissive. And another option is to be kind of like, well, they're just, I don't know, maybe brainwashed or something like that. But I think the best thing you can do is to try to get into someone's mindset and believe them and say like, okay, you're afraid. Like, and so I think that's like kind of the starting place, and then try to think, if I was afraid of that, like what would make me feel more confident? So I think there's a lot of, I don't fully know the answer, but I do agree that trust in a democratic system is essential for people to participate in it and to see it as legitimate, which I think are really interchangeable things. The third party guarantees, that's interestingly drawn from, so our term, the subversion dilemma, it comes from the prisoner's dilemma, but actually more specifically comes from the security dilemma in international politics, which has been written about by theorists of international war that say, okay, why did countries go to war when actually it's a net loss? It makes no sense. How do you rationally do that? And that was kind of how I got into thinking about how do you, as a citizen, vote away your democracy when it's a net loss? And so it's a similar setup, or basically this idea where both sides are building up arms and seeing the other side as increasingly threatening until someone, pulls a trigger, and then you're in a war. One of the documented ways to potentially stop or prevent that is third-party guarantees, because basically what you want is, it's an information problem. It's hard to see the actual intentions of the other side. And so I think that this is one of the information on intentions of another group, I think is a really interesting problem that in conflict studies in general. But third-party guarantees would be, or costly signals of good faith. It sounds like that maybe they're both somewhat understandable, but they're also just like a little bit international relations jargon. Costly signals of good faith would be like, making like some kind of major statement that will make you look really bad if you go back on it, in terms of your willingness to uphold, the election results. Or third-party guarantees would be some kind of third party. I mean, in a lot of countries, it's an international organization. I don't think we typically have that as much in the United States because we're very American exceptionalist, but some kind of neutral party that could act as more of a guarantor of election results, for instance, as opposed to if people aren't feeling confident in what we already have. But I actually think that one of the things that can happen is just educational initiatives about the election process itself. And there have been some interesting work on that. There's this whole documentary where, meet the election workers, and it seems to have a positive effect when people actually see the faces and see the actual the sacrifice and the really hard work that American people put into making our elections secure and doing a good job with that.
Yeah, and I see it a little bit like jury duty. It's like people take that seriously, regardless of what, sort of color hat they wear or the stripes they wear or whatever. They seem to take that seriously, and I think that applies to voting, the people that work with voting, and also something like jury duty, where you can set that down and try to look at the facts. And I know, so far at least, I think that's mostly true. And yeah, I always tell people, if you think voting is rigged, go work at an election. Go work an election cycle. I mean, it's just the exact opposite. Everybody's trying so hard to keep it fair and done properly. Yeah, so I guess you've already mentioned a few, but I don't know if there's any other ideas that you've had to sort of ways to overcome this perception gap, and particularly if they think of anything that might scale.
Yeah, I think that it's an ongoing thought process for me. I mean, the most obvious thing, and it's something that I'm working on trying to test, is basically the start to this cycle is propaganda. It's propaganda from someone who's trying to undermine democracy. And so you need to propagandize as well for what's true, at least as well, if not better, for what's true than what's false. So that's one thing that we're looking at, is just public messaging campaigns that would have this type of information, and whether putting these onto social media, how much exposure to that will be helpful to kind of potentially make people see things differently in real environments that they're in. That's one thing definitely looking at. There's some a little more creative ideas. I think we mentioned in the paper, I think that we asked the participants in our study if they would be willing to make a one-to-one pact with someone from the other party to be held accountable for who they're voting for in terms of their democratic behavior. That that obviously would be a tricky thing to implement, but I think that this grassroots approach also has something to it, especially thinking about what's a grassroots scalable approach. I don't think you can get everyone in the room to have these necessarily deep conversations, but you could potentially have something where you get sufficient numbers to buy into this idea that we believe in democracy as a people, both Democrat and Republican, as part of our identity, as citizens.
Well, I think even identifying some things that we both say these are things we want to hold ourselves accountable, each other accountable to, would be huge, right? Because that's even hard, right?
Yeah. And so actually a place where I'm trying to take my research next, I mentioned I study nonviolent action. So I think thinking about what it means to be a citizen right now is really interesting, and essentially getting people enthusiastic about that in a nonpartisan way. And one possible avenue to that being on these issues that we can agree on about democracy, because I think the ones that we don't agree on are getting a lot of attention. And so, for instance, can you have protests that are not seen as partisan? Because right now, I think people might be protesting for what they believe is an essential element of democracy, but it's being seen as partisan by the other side because of maybe the particularity of it. And so what if we could start having demonstrations that are actually co-partisan? I think that would be, even just as an experience for people, and an important way forward. But But one thing I'm trying to think about is just how could that happen? Like how would people be brought into that space? But I do think that there's room for it.
Well, I like this idea of positive propaganda. I haven't really heard that before because, there's always this, I think of this distinction between, sort of we sort of position two things that I think is a false setup because we sort of set disinformation over here and then next to that we put up like good journalism. And they're not really the same because they have different goals. At least with bad actors, disinformation from bad actors is really about trying to get a result, an effect, trying to do something, and it's trying to drive wedge issues and all kind. There's some kind of a motivation behind it they're trying to actually. Whereas, good journalism is just trying to inform you. It doesn't really have a second. It's not trying to get a second effect. It's just trying to say what the world is. So to me, it sounds almost like the positive propaganda is a little bit more like the counter to the negative propaganda, a little bit more.
Yeah, actually, I'm really glad that you saw that because it's something I'm really passionate about. I think that it is sometimes a fault of people who have truth on their side that they think all they need to do is just say the truth. And certainly from a political scientist perspective, it's a fault of ours to just give people statistics, which is the absolute worst. I think actually if there's something that other scholars might pick up from our study, it's like this small methodological point, but we don't tell people statistics. What I actually did was notice that me and my friends are addicted to Duolingo, and I tried to create an intervention that felt as much like Duolingo as I could. And I then wrote a letter to Duolingo and I said, will you please help me make Duolingo for politics in America? And I have not heard back, but I can still hope. So I think this gamification, we took a gamification entertainment route where it felt like it had some emotional tone. And I think that's important to see people as old people, and they're not just like truth robots, but that emotions are mediating our conception of what's real and what's important and what sticks out. And so again, it comes back to that. I think for me, a lot of literature and movement building is really good with that. It's you can't just say, oh, these people are being oppressed. You have to actually tell a story. You have to actually move people.
Right. I mean, somehow we have to make sort of aspirational messages as, sort of, I don't know, viral as the negative ones.
Yeah.
Which is hard because, like you say, it's kind of not our human nature, biological nature.
Yeah. I mean, there must be something in us too, though, that needs that because, I think that's how we function as individuals. If we were to just spiral into fear, then we wouldn't be a functioning species that made it this far. So I think there also is this way that we're scanning for opportunity and scanning for possibility, and inspired by beauty and inspired by creativity and inspired by hope. So I think these are real things as well.
All right. Well, thank you very much, Alia, for making the time. It's been a really interesting conversation. I definitely want to keep up with what your next research project is.
Yeah, thank you so much. It's really fun to talk with you about this, and love to talk with you again.
That'd be great. Good to see you.
Yeah, you too.
Okay. Bye-bye. That is it for this episode of the Outrage Overload Podcast. For links to everything we talked about on this episode, go to outrageoverload.net. Our focus for 2024 is to make the best show possible, to add the most value to you, our listeners. And the best way we can keep improving on that is to hear from you. What do you like to see? What do you want to see? What would make this show more valuable for you? You can give us that feedback at outrageoverload@gmail.com. Or if you're worried about hurting my feelings, you can go directly to outrageoverload.net/survey and give those comments anonymously. So thanks again for listening, and look for a new episode in a couple of weeks.